Fair college student crushed by debt made a calculated gamble. Marriage to immense wealth. His bride was a sharp-witted widow, decades his senior, known for her formidable fortune and guarded isolation. The deal was pure transaction, a ring for immediate debt erasure and a vast promised inheritance. He moved into her sprawling East Coast estate, choosing to ignore the uniformed guards and the palpable atmosphere of dread. But his transactional bliss lasted exactly 7 days. That is when he discovered the real reason for the fortune's size and the bloody history of the man whose name he now shares. He married wealth. He inherited a war. The stifling heat inside the cramped, rented room was merely a physical manifestation of the crushing pressure mounting on Jackson Reed, 22, a student whose worn yet determined eyes usually held the focus of a tireless academic, but now showed only perpetual exhaustion. His degree from Cresthaven University meant nothing against the insurmountable wall of debt looming over him. He was not weeks from graduation. He was days from financial ruin, expulsion, and the subsequent lifetime of crippling servitude that predatory loans guaranteed. The air conditioning unit rattled a pathetic protest against the August humidity, mirroring the despair rattling inside Jackson's own chest. It was this desperation, this absolute void of viable alternatives, that had driven him to the grand, oppressive offices of Sterling and Associates. He wasn't seeking a loan. He was seeking a lifeline, regardless of the ethical cost. The details of the proposition, codified in the prenuptial covenant, were brutally simple and entirely transactional. Jackson would gain immediate and complete debt relief, a significant trust fund to be administered monthly, and the promise of vast inheritance upon the passing of his intended spouse. In return, he offered only his name, his youth, and his legal capacity as a proxy. He met her in a soundproof private chamber, the room smelling faintly of aged leather and expensive, unfamiliar perfume. Vivian Sterling, 71, was everything the rumors suggested. Impeccably dressed in an iron-gray silk suit, her frame was thin but her posture severe, radiating a formidable and controlled intelligence that made the 22-year-old student feel impossibly young and small. Her piercing grey eyes dissected him, not judging his poverty but calculating his utility. "You understand the terms, Mr. Reed?" Vivian's voice was low, clear, and utterly devoid of warmth. "This is a contract of convenience. Sentiment is unnecessary, and expectation of anything resembling a traditional marriage is absurd. You will provide companionship when requested and legal representation always. You are my proxy, nothing more. Should you breach confidentiality or attempt to leverage this agreement for personal gain beyond the specified terms, the penalties are comprehensive." Jackson swallowed, the paper of the prenuptial covenant feeling like lead in his hand. It was the only way out. "I understand, Mrs. Sterling. It is purely business." Vivian offered a fraction of a smile, a chilling, practiced movement that didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Business can be so much cleaner than love." The deal was finalized swiftly. The legal team worked with the efficiency of a high-end Swiss clock. By the time the ink dried on the final signature, Jackson Reed's debt was wiped clean, replaced by the crushing psychological weight of his new reality. The unconventional ceremony took place 3 days later, not in a grand hall or a warm church, but in the echoing silence of Blackwood Manor. The manor was less a home and more a monolithic statement of secluded wealth, situated on a dramatic stretch of the East Coast, constantly mist-shrouded and perpetually silent. It was fortress-like, every window seeming to look out onto nothing but endless woods or the unforgiving Atlantic. The wedding itself was a minimalist, cold affair. A justice of the peace, 2 lawyers and 3 staff members, all observing the proceedings with the practiced, impassive gaze of those who had witnessed too much to ever be surprised. Jackson wore a rented tuxedo that felt alien. Vivian wore a simple, tailored cream dress that looked as expensive as his entire tuition. After the vows, which sounded hollow and profane, Jackson was officially ushered into his new life. His meager belongings were already placed in the East Wing guest suite, a room larger than his entire previous apartment, equipped with antique furniture and a level of comfort that felt aggressively foreign. The first person he truly registered upon entering the permanent orbit of Blackwood Manor was the head of security, Marcus Cole, 46. Marcus was built like a reinforced steel beam, with close-cropped hair and a stone face that seemed incapable of expressing human emotion. He moved through the mansion's labyrinthine halls with a silent, intimidating efficiency. Jackson caught sight of the discreet earpiece and the slight bulge beneath Marcus' perfectly tailored jacket. This wasn't mere residential security. This was private military protection. The atmosphere in the manor was one of perpetual vigilance. There were cameras everywhere, often cleverly disguised as ornamental carvings or old clock faces. The staff were omnipresent yet invisible, executing their duties without noise or interaction. Jackson spent his days either trying to acclimatize to the absurd luxury, the personal chef, the 24-hour butler service, or attempting to continue his studies remotely, the weight of the enormous mahogany desk in his suite, a constant suffocating reminder of the sacrifice he had made in 2024. Vivian was precise in her schedule. They ate dinner together, a formal, quiet affair where the conversation was restricted to global economics, high culture, or the logistical needs of the manor. She never spoke about the source of her wealth, merely referring to her late husband's manufacturing ventures with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Your presence legitimizes things, Jackson," she told him on the fifth night, swirling a glass of deep red wine. "A young, ambitious student from a good, if desperate, family. It's useful camouflage." Jackson tried to rationalize the strangeness. Rich people were eccentric. Old money had secrets. The security was simply appropriate for such extreme wealth. He forced himself to believe the official narrative. Eleanor Hawthorne, Vivian's maiden name, inherited a fortune from a successful industrialist, Silas Thorne, who had died 5 years prior in 2019. The quiet wealth was simply very, very protected. He maintained this fragile illusion for 6 days. The seventh day dawned grey and oppressive. Vivian had traveled to New York for the day, leaving Jackson effectively alone, save for Marcus Cole and the silent network of staff. Restless, Jackson descended to the ground-floor library, a cavernous room housing thousands of volumes, many clearly untouched for decades. He was searching for a rare edition of Kant, tucked away in the dusty West Wing annex, when the sequence of events began that would instantly shred his carefully constructed denial. Reaching for a book on a high shelf, his hand brushed against a small, ornate wooden panel built into the wall molding. The panel slid slightly, revealing a small, velvet-lined recess. It wasn't a mechanism. It was a hiding spot. Inside lay a single, smooth rectangle of bone-white polymer, the ivory keycard. Jackson stared at the keycard. It looked like an expensive hotel access key, but with no branding, only a faint, stylized hawk embossed on one corner. The sheer concealment of the item was unsettling. Curiosity, the lethal companion to his desperation, took over. He slipped the card into his pocket and began to methodically inspect the library walls, focusing on areas Marcus Cole and the staff seemed to avoid. He discovered the entry point behind a towering built-in map cabinet that appeared permanently fixed to the wall. It took 10 minutes of careful observation to notice the tiny seam where the cabinet met the floorboards, and another 5 to find the discreet pressure plate disguised as an electrical outlet cover. He pressed the plate. The map cabinet didn't slide or swing. It silently retracted into the stone wall with mechanical precision, revealing a thick stainless steel door, completely flush with the surrounding wall. This was not a panic room. This was a vault. Fear coiled in Jackson's stomach, instantly cold and metallic. He hesitated for a long, agonizing minute, debating retreat. Go back to his room. Forget the keycard. Preserve the illusion of safety. But the inheritance, the vast unspoken promise, was at stake. If this vault contained the true extent of the assets, he needed to know what he was legally bound to inherit. Jackson inserted the ivory keycard into the reader beside the vault door. A soft green light blinked, and the airlock hissed. He stepped across the threshold. The cold, climate-controlled air of the Thorne Vault hit him instantly. It was a space dedicated entirely to preservation and archive, far deeper and more extensive than any basement safe. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with gold bars or jewelry, but with file boxes, microfiche, and sealed records. This wasn't a bank vault. It was an organizational archive. Jackson moved slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, every nerve screaming that he was trespassing on territory that was far deadlier than mere wealthy eccentricity. The files were neatly labeled, catalogued chronologically, beginning in the late 1980s. He saw names, code names, jurisdictions he recognized from news reports, not as legitimate business entities, but as known tax havens and offshore banking fronts. His gaze finally fixed on the central pedestal, protected under a glass case like a priceless artifact. It was a large, leather-bound volume. The cover stained a deep, unsettling maroon, nearly black. The Crimson Ledger. His hands trembled as he opened the cover. The first page was a dedication, dated 1998, the estimated peak operational era of the Thorn Syndicate. The handwriting within was meticulous, almost artistic, but the content was monstrous. This was not a ledger of legitimate transactions. It was a highly detailed, comprehensive accounting of illicit dealings, extortion rackets across 3 states, detailed flowcharts of international smuggling routes, political bribes catalogued by name and date, and worst of all, a chillingly sterile breakdown of disputes resolved. Coded entries that Jackson immediately understood referred to violent retaliations and murders. The revelation of Silas Thorn was complete and irreversible. Silas Thorn, the quiet industrialist, was an absolute fabrication. The photographs kept with the ledger showed a man with broad shoulders and an intensely authoritarian gaze, the kind of man who commanded absolute obedience. He was the founder and iron-fisted head of a major, decade-spanning criminal syndicate. He hadn't run a quiet manufacturing company, he had run the enterprise. Jackson flipped through sections detailing massive acquisitions of real estate under shell companies, the very companies whose ownership now trickled down to him through the prenuptial covenant. He wasn't inheriting steel mills, he was inheriting laundered assets built on blood. The realization hit Jackson with the force of a physical blow. He had married into the Mafia. 7 days. 7 days separated Jackson Reed, the desperately poor college student, from Jackson Reed, the unwitting legal proxy for the most powerful and ruthless criminal legacy on the East Coast. His marriage had instantly transformed from a financial windfall into a deadly liability. He was now legally bound to a Mafia legacy, privy to dangerous secrets, and a potential heir to illicit assets that were still very much controlled by active, violent entities detailed within the very pages he held. He slammed the Crimson Ledger shut, his breath catching in his throat. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but his pragmatic survival instinct, the same instinct that allowed him to sign the covenant in the first place, forced him to think clearly. Escape was impossible. Marcus Cole was outside. The manor was a fortress. If he ran, he would carry the secrets and the liability with him, and the syndicate would ensure his silence. He carefully replaced the Crimson Ledger and locked the vault, replacing the ivory keycard exactly where he found it. He retreated to his room, the knowledge burning a hole in his consciousness. He had to navigate this treacherous new reality, and that meant confronting the only other person who knew the truth, Vivian Sterling. He waited, pacing the length of his absurdly luxurious suite for 6 hours, the setting sun painting the Atlantic a menacing shade of orange and grey. When he heard the discreet sound of the Rolls-Royce pulling into the motor court, he was already at the top of the grand staircase, the weight of the Crimson Ledger's secrets making his legs feel leaden. Vivian entered the main hall, followed by Marcus Cole, who took her coat and disappeared as silently as he arrived. Vivian looked tired, perhaps even fragile, but the moment her eyes met Jackson's, the facade vanished. She saw the change in him instantly. The naive student was gone, replaced by a man terrified and fully informed. "You look pale, Jackson," she observed, her voice measured. She moved toward the sitting room. "Did you finally look into the family's true history?" Jackson followed her, rage fighting with sheer, paralyzing fear. This was the ultimate confrontation. "Manufacturing," Jackson whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Silas Thorn didn't manufacture steel, Vivian. He manufactured terror. I found the vault. I found the Crimson Ledger. Extortion, murder, syndicates." Vivian settled into an armchair, crossing her legs with unnerving composure. She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. "And?" she challenged, her gaze piercing him. "You were broke, Jackson. Now you are solvent. What is the complaint? The complaint is that I'm bound to a criminal organization. I'm an heir to active illicit assets. This isn't wealth, Vivian. This is a liability that gets people killed." Was that the plan all along? To ensnare a clean proxy to launder the transition after 2019? Vivian leaned forward, her expression softening into something colder than anger. Cold logic. "You are correct in your assessment. Silas was heavy-handed. After his death in 2019, the structure had to be stabilized. The assets needed a legitimate, clean transfer. A sudden, massive disbursement to offshore entities would attract the wrong kind of attention. The marriage provided the perfect legal insulation, Jackson. A young, innocent name legally bound to the estate. You are a shield. And what about you? Jackson demanded, stepping closer, his voice strained. Are you the isolated widow I married, or the architect who engineered this entire transition? Vivian smiled again, that chilling, intellectual smile. I was Silas' wife, Jackson, but I was never merely his widow. Silas provided the brute force. I provided the framework. I ran the logistics. I managed the politics. He was the iron fist. I was the mind that aimed it. Since 2019, I have been the sentinel protecting this fortune. The realization solidified Jackson's terror. He hadn't married a grieving widow. He had married the calculated operator who ensured the Empire's survival after the legend fell. The syndicate is not dissolved, Vivian continued, her voice taking on a new, commanding tone. It is merely decentralized. The men who worked for Silas, they respect power and they respect legacy. They respect the framework I established. And now, Jackson, they must respect you, because you are the legal conduit for the wealth that sustains them. You are protected, provided you remain here under my guidance and play your role. She laid out the ultimate stakes with clinical precision. You have 3 options. 1. Run. You know too much, Jackson. You carry the secrets. The syndicate will find you, and your life will end swiftly and violently, and your death will be listed as a tragic accidental suicide, saving us the cleanup fee. 2. Inform the authorities. They will seize everything, but you will still be exposed as an accessory, and the men who still draw breath and profit from this organization will ensure you never make it to trial. 3. Accept your position. You are debt-free. You have a lifetime of guaranteed security, provided you learn quickly and obey my instructions. You become the legitimate public face. I handle the darkness. Jackson stared at the woman who was legally his wife. She was offering him a gilded, lifelong imprisonment, enforced by the very organization she had just revealed. He thought of his life just 7 days ago. The cold, crushing debt, the dead-end future. He thought of the alternative now. A life hunted, terrified, and ultimately terminated. He saw the ruthless pragmatism in Vivian, and terrifyingly, he recognized the nascent stirrings of that same pragmatism in himself. He was no longer naive. He was a survivor. And if I choose option 3? Jackson finally managed. The question not a surrender, but a terrifying choice for survival. Vivian's gray eyes gleamed with approval. Then Jackson read, you learn to move through the shadows without blinking. You learn to speak the language of power, not the language of poverty. You continue your education, not at Cresthaven University, but here, in the practical administration of legacy assets. We ensure your survival, and in turn you ensure the future of the Thorn Empire. He was trapped. His marriage of convenience had secured his financial future, but only by locking him into a far greater danger. There was no escape, only adaptation. Jackson Reed looked at Vivian Sterling, the formidable sentinel of a bloody fortune, and made his decision. I stay, Jackson said, the word ringing with finality, sealing his fate as the legal inheritor and perhaps the eventual victim of the syndicate. His new life began, not as a student seeking wealth, but as a hostage learning to live within a fortress built on secrets, blood, and the constant, silent surveillance of Marcus Cole. The only question that remained was how long he could survive playing the heir to a crime family, under the ever-watchful eye of the woman who had engineered his capture. The quiet of Blackwood Manor after Jackson's desperate declaration, I stay, was not peaceful but taut, like a wire drawn too thin. The air conditioning, usually imperceptible, now seemed to circulate the chilling certainty of his fate. Vivian observed him, her grey eyes reflecting none of the turmoil that raged beneath his tired demeanor. It was not relief she displayed, but the confirmation of a successful hypothesis. She had calculated his survival instinct correctly. Good, Vivian stated, lifting a delicate crystal glass from the low table. Survival is the only true currency, Jackson. Everything else is negotiable. Sit. We have wasted 7 days on theatricals. Now, we begin your education. Jackson obeyed, sinking onto the silk upholstery. He felt less like a husband and more like a captured piece on a massive, deadly chessboard. You believe you are trapped by the legal documents you signed, Vivian began, swirling the remnant of her wine. That is the student's error. The prenuptial covenant merely gives you ownership, the public face. It is nothing more than expensive camouflage. The true chains, the ones that bind you and keep you alive, are the assets themselves. You must understand how they breathe. She spent the next hour dissecting the mechanics of the wealth he had inherited, speaking with the authority of a tenured professor, lecturing on highly specialized law. She explained the use of layered shell corporations, from manufacturing fronts in Delaware to holding companies in the Cayman Islands, all designed to channel capital acquired through means detailed in the Crimson Ledger. Jackson had studied finance, but this was a masterclass in global illicit money movement. He realized the scale was galactic. This wasn't merely local organized crime, this was a shadow economic empire. Silas built the structure, Vivian explained, a flicker of something akin to pride entering her voice. He was brutal but patient. When he passed, the flow had to remain undisturbed. His old guard, the regional supervisors, the money handlers, they watch the ledger. If the flow stops, or if a new conduit appears weak, they challenge it. You, Jackson, are that conduit. A weak conduit attracts predators. So, my job is to look strong? Jackson asked, the absurdity of the situation starting to replace the pure terror with a cold, protective shell. Your job is to become strong, and to never ever be naive again. The following morning marked the official beginning of Jackson's tenure as the syndicate's unwitting proxy. His life at Blackwood Manor transitioned from uneasy luxury to rigorous paranoid schooling. Cresthaven University was a distant, irrelevant memory. His new curriculum focused on 3 critical areas: asset management, Vivian's domain; security protocols, Marcus's silent domain; and internal hierarchy, a dangerous area they both skirted. Vivian insisted that Jackson spend 3 hours every afternoon in the Thorn Vault. The first time he re-entered the climate-controlled archive, the sterile cold felt like the moral vacuum he had stepped into. He was forced to study the Crimson Ledger page by page. The sheer volume of transactions detailed within the ledger was numbing. It wasn't the violence that was the most horrifying. It was the meticulous accounting of that violence. A shipment of contraband, marked disbursement, $5. A political favor noted as resolution, Manhattan DA, $500K. The section marked disputes resolved was the worst, detailing 8 names over 5 years, accompanied by small, neat handwritten codes referring to disposal methods and costs incurred by the cleanup crew. Silas Thorne had treated murder as an administrative expense. Jackson learned the true extent of the empire's reach. They owned infrastructure, manipulated stock in legitimate companies, and controlled major union heads in 3 states. The manor itself, Blackwood, was the epicenter, the final holding tank before assets were dispersed legally. Vivian sat across from him in the vault, usually working on a high-end laptop, cross-referencing ledger entries with modern offshore holdings. She never touched the ledger itself, she simply guided Jackson's attention. "Look at the 1998 entry for Project Pelican," she commanded one afternoon. Jackson traced the thin, elegant handwriting. Project Pelican, acquisition of 3 major waterfront properties in South Carolina, ostensibly for seafood processing. The actual notation under purpose read, Deep Water Narcotics Transport Hub, Established Security Contracts, MC. Jackson looked up at Vivian, the realization sharp and unpleasant. MC is Marcus Cole. Vivian gave a subtle nod. Marcus has been with the family since he was 20. He oversaw Project Pelican's operations for 2 decades. He doesn't merely guard this house, Jackson. He is the physical manifestation of the enforcement arm. He is loyal to Silas's legacy, which, by extension, is now tied to you. The tension with Marcus was inescapable. Jackson understood that Marcus was the ultimate insurance policy. If Jackson betrayed Vivian, Marcus would handle the dispute resolution. Marcus maintained his granite silence, but his presence was a constant physical weight. Whenever Jackson moved around the house, Marcus was always there, at the end of the hall near the study door, observing from the perimeter of the manicured grounds. Jackson was perpetually under surveillance, not just by cameras, but by the man who had written the code for established security contracts. One evening, Jackson attempted to retrieve a forgotten folder from the library, the room where he had found the ivory keycard. As he approached the retracted map cabinet, Marcus stepped out of the shadows. "The vault is locked for the night," Marcus stated, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, the first unnecessary words Jackson had ever heard him speak. I wasn't going to the vault, Jackson replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline surge. Just a folder I left in the main reading room. Marcus didn't move. His gaze was flat, clinical. Everything you need is in your suite, Reed. You do not wander the property unescorted, particularly not the West Wing. You stay near Mrs. Sterling's sightlines. The implied threat was staggering. Marcus wasn't a guard controlling property access. He was a warden controlling the prisoners' movement. Jackson realized that Marcus was testing him, assessing the new heir's compliance. Jackson held Marcus's gaze for a beat too long, an involuntary flare of defiance rising. He instantly suppressed it. Defiance was suicide. He was no longer the desperate student. He was the pragmatic survivor. Understood, Marcus, Jackson said, turning back toward the stairs. My apologies. Still learning the boundaries. He walked away, feeling the heavy, silent scrutiny of Marcus on his back until he reached the second-floor landing. The exchange solidified the terrifying reality. His agreement with Vivian was less a partnership and more a highly conditional protection racket. Weeks bled into months. The autumn storms of the East Coast raged outside Blackwood Manor, reflecting the internal turmoil. Jackson stopped seeing the manor as a mansion. He saw the reinforced steel structure, the discreet communications antennae, the tactical positions Marcus' men took around the perimeter. Vivian pushed him relentlessly. She required him to memorize the corporate structures of the shell companies. She insisted he learn the names of the regional supervisors, the men who had worked for Silas and still ran the day-to-day enforcement and finance operations in Philadelphia, Boston, and Miami. These men were dangerous, volatile, and deeply suspicious of the young, educated stranger who had suddenly been placed at the top of the money flow. They see you as a temporary shield, Jackson, Vivian warned him over a particularly silent dinner. If they sense weakness, they will try to test the boundaries. They will try to cut you out and deal directly with me, or worse, they will move to destabilize the whole operation to take control. You must be impenetrable. One chilly Tuesday in late October, the theoretical danger became immediate and real. This was the moment of climax, the test Vivian had been preparing him for. Jackson was in the study, reviewing a stack of documents concerning a major land acquisition in New Jersey, a massive, complex transaction designed to absorb ill-gotten gains into legitimate real estate holdings. Vivian was in the adjoining communications room. Suddenly the intercom buzzed, cutting through the heavy silence. Mrs. Sterling, Marcus' voice, tight and low, cut across the line. Unscheduled, encrypted satellite call. Direct line from Phoenix. Hes demanding to speak with the principal signatory immediately. Phoenix. Jackson recognized the code name instantly. It belonged to the supervisor of the Philadelphia operation, known for his volatility and his intense loyalty to the old ways of Silas. He was the most likely to challenge the new structure. Vivian appeared in the study doorway, her expression utterly calm, but her eyes were sharp with anticipation. Marcus, patch it to the secure line in the study. Jackson, you take this. I will be on the muted extension. Do not refer to me. Do not show weakness. This is not a discussion. This is a confirmation of authority. If you fail, he will take that as an invitation to chaos. Jackson's throat went dry. He had spent months studying maps, ledgers, and legal documents. He had not practiced surviving a hostile confrontation with a man who could order him killed with a single word. Vivian gave him one last razor-sharp instruction. He will ask about the disposition of the Jersey Trust. Silas promised him a cut. He is testing if you know the specifics, and more importantly, if you dare deny him. Jackson nodded, sweat prickling his palms. He picked up the heavy, secure phone handset. The line crackled, followed by the sound of heavy breathing on the other end. "This is Jackson Reed," he said, forcing his voice to adopt a low, authoritative resonance he didn't feel. The voice on the other end was rough, laced with decades of street grime and power, entirely devoid of deference. Jackson Reed, the college boy. Word travels slow, but it travels. 5 years we run this clean, and now Thorne's widow puts a student in the driver's seat. You think you know what you're steering? I know the assets, Jackson replied, channeling Vivian's earlier calm. I am the executor and the legal principal for the Thorne estate. Any concerns regarding the movement of assets are directed to me. Concerns are paramount, Phoenix growled. I need the Jersey Trust resolved. Silas promised me 20% on the liquidation of that New Jersey land. The paperwork is stalled since the new signatory took over. I need my due, Jackson. The use of his first name was a deliberate slight, an attempt to minimize his authority. The Jersey Trust. Jackson knew the specific property. It was a complex holding worth over $80 million, tied up in environmental regulations to mask its true value. Silas had indeed used it as a future reward for Phoenix, but the timing of its release was crucial for Vivian's current laundering strategy. Jackson felt the pressure rising, a sudden blinding heat of panic. He glanced up. Vivian, though silent, watched him with an intensity that demanded success. He remembered Vivian's lesson. Never deny outright, but always control the timetable. The Jersey Trust Phoenix is currently designated for regulatory restructuring due to the environmental risk assessment that needs to be filed next month, Jackson said, reciting the prepared legal jargon Vivian had drilled into him, lending it an air of bureaucratic weight. If you force the liquidation now, the resulting inquiry will freeze the entire $79 million asset base for 2 years, and you will receive exactly zero. Your 20% is guaranteed under the existing covenant. He paused, gathering every ounce of confidence he could muster. However, Jackson continued, leaning into the phone, projecting the cold authority of the man who signs the checks. I can initiate a temporary disbursement from the Newark Holding Company, a fraction of your share, to cover your short-term operational costs, $700,000 today. The remaining percentage of the Jersey Trust will be released upon completion of the restructuring, exactly 6 months from now, as per the established timeline. He had taken control of the flow, offering a short-term solution while maintaining the long-term schedule. He had used the syndicate's own jargon, Newark Holding Company, and the bureaucracy of the legitimate world regulatory restructuring as weapons. Silence stretched across the line, heavy and dangerous. Jackson could practically hear the man calculating the risk and reward. Finally, Phoenix sighed, a sound of grudging acceptance. $700,000 from Newark. Fine. Send the wire instructions to the usual drop. 6 months, Reed. You missed that timeline, and I come to Blackwood myself to retrieve what's mine, you understand? I understand the covenants, Phoenix, Jackson responded coolly. The transfer will be made within the hour. Good day. He set the receiver down, his hand trembling violently. The sound of the click was deafening. He stared at the device, horrified by the terrifying, exhilarating rush of adrenaline. He had just successfully navigated a confrontation with a Mafia boss, and lived. Vivian stepped forward, her controlled demeanor cracking slightly, not into emotion but into pure professional satisfaction. You didn't flinch, she murmured, a genuine assessment. You leveraged the bureaucracy and you maintained the schedule. Excellent, Jackson. You used the language of power. I'm learning, Jackson admitted, his voice raspy. The terror was still there, but beneath it, a tiny, hard kernel of competence had formed. He had survived the test. He was a functional part of the machine. Vivian then took his face in her surprisingly strong, cool hands, her gaze intense. Listen to me, Jackson. That was not a threat to the money. That was a threat to your life. Phoenix needed to know if he could simply walk over the new signatory. You just proved that the cost of killing you is higher than the benefit of leaving you alive. That is the only protection Blackwood Manor truly offers. With the immediate threat neutralized, the routine intensified. Jackson was now undeniably useful. Vivian began to involve him in the more sensitive aspects of asset protection. He was tasked with reviewing legal defense strategies for certain corporate incidents, which he knew were veiled references to criminal charges against low-level operatives. The manor, once a symbol of impossible wealth, now felt like a gilded cage constructed of complex legal documents and enforced by lethal men like Marcus. Jackson rarely left the grounds. His few trips out, always under Marcus' watchful armed escort, were limited to meetings with high-powered attorneys in Manhattan, where he sat silently, signing documents as the legal proxy. He was constantly aware of his transformation. The perpetual exhaustion in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating vigilance. The worn student demeanor was gone, replaced by the polished, impassive expression required of an heir to a fortune built on blood. He understood the chilling pragmatism of Vivian, because he had internalized it. His survival depended on it. He thought often of his life 7 days after he married Vivian, the moment he opened the Crimson Ledger. He had been terrified of the financial ruin of Cresthaven. Now he was terrified of a wrong move that would invite Marcus Cole to perform a dispute resolution. But the fear was functional. It kept him sharp. Vivian had succeeded. Jackson Reed was no longer Jackson Reed, the poor college student. He was Jackson Reed, the Sentinel's proxy, the legitimate face of the Thorn Syndicate's illicit wealth. One evening, nearly 6 months after the confrontation with Phoenix, Jackson sat in the library late, the grand room silent save for the shifting wind outside. Vivian was upstairs. He was reviewing the final disposition documents for the Jersey Trust. The transfer was set for tomorrow, on schedule. He pulled the ivory keycard from his desk drawer. He had kept it, hidden since the day he found it. He knew the location of the vault, the combination, the contents. He knew the deepest, darkest secrets of the organization. He was the single biggest liability to the syndicate, and simultaneously, its most valuable asset. He walked toward the retracted map cabinet, inserted the keycard, and stepped inside the Thorn vault. He didn't open the crimson ledger this time. He just inhaled the cold, preserved air. Jackson wasn't looking for escape anymore. He was looking at the future. He had adapted to the darkness. He had learned the language. He had proven his worth to Vivian, and more terrifyingly, to Phoenix, and the unseen network of violent men who now respected his authority. He was bound, legally and practically, to the legacy. His only path now was forward, deep into the labyrinth. He secured the vault, replaced the ivory keycard, and walked back to his opulent prison suite. The fear was still a constant companion, but it was now laced with a dangerous sense of control. He looked out the window at the rough Atlantic, the sea stretching endlessly into the darkness. He had married for money and found a life defined by murder and millions. He was the heir, the protector, the hostage, and perhaps inevitably the next victim. But he was alive, and he was learning how to play the syndicate's game. Jackson knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that Blackwood Manor was his forever. His new life had begun, not with a wedding, but with the cold, precise decision to survive the consequences of his ambition. He was the shield, and the price of that protection was absolute, lifelong servitude to the woman who controlled the shadows. The transfer of $700,000 to Phoenix had done more than just stabilize the Philadelphia operation. It had formalized Jackson's status. He was no longer merely Vivian's husband or the student proxy. He was a recognized, if begrudgingly tolerated, pillar of the syndicate's financial structure. The air around Blackwood Manor did not lighten, but Jackson's perception sharpened. He now navigated the opulence not with awe, but with a strategic understanding of its vulnerability. The routine deepened. Vivian now treated him less like a protege and more like a necessary colleague. Her lessons shifted from the anatomy of the syndicate to the psychology of control. She spent hours detailing the internal feuds and loyalties that had defined Silas, decades in power. Silas was a tyrant, but an efficient one, Vivian remarked one afternoon in the sun-drenched study, looking over documents concerning a legitimate shipping logistics firm they secretly controlled. His genius was in making his underlings fight each other for scraps, thus ensuring no single power could challenge him. But the moment he was gone, those feuds became structural weaknesses. They look at you, Jackson, and they see an opportunity to realign the board. And you see me as the necessary imbalance, Jackson concluded, signing his name carefully onto a complex acquisition form, a name that now carried the weight of hundreds of millions. I see you as the only solution that doesn't involve me personally going to war with the men who believe they deserve the throne more than any wife or college boy, Vivian corrected him, her voice dry and factual. They tolerate me because of the name, but they loathe my intellect. They need a man in the chair regardless of his history, provided he is capable of wielding fear. Jackson understood that fear was the true inheritance. He had to embody it, project it, and execute it when necessary. The constant surveillance from Marcus became less about monitoring a prisoner and more about coordinating the defense of an asset. Jackson and Marcus began a silent, tense collaboration. When Jackson needed documents retrieved from outside counsel, Marcus handled the logistics and security with flawless precision. Yet, the physical barrier between them remained absolute. Marcus never smiled, never offered a superfluous word, and never let Jackson forget that his life existed solely at the pleasure of Vivian's ongoing security. Jackson needed to break that silence, not out of camaraderie, but out of necessity. He needed to understand the scope of his protection. One rainy evening, Jackson found Marcus polishing a tactical rifle in the armory, a discreet, concrete-lined room in the manor's sub-basement, accessible only to Marcus and his inner circle. Jackson walked in, uninvited, carrying a folder concerning the updated security budget. Marcus didn't look up, but the movement of his hands slowed marginally. The cold smell of oil and steel filled the air. "The request for the new perimeter cameras is approved," Jackson stated, placing the folder on a workbench near Marcus. "I need to know if the specs are sufficient, or if the Boston supervisor's operation poses a greater risk than you've budgeted for." Marcus finally lifted his eyes. They were the color of slate, hard and expressionless. "Boston is contained. His operation is clean, compartmentalized. He doesn't challenge the hierarchy, he just feeds the machine." "And who challenges the hierarchy?" Jackson pressed. Marcus placed the cleaning rod down and looked directly at Jackson. "Those who think they can survive the fallout. Phoenix tested your nerve. The others are waiting for your mistake. But the real threat isn't outside." The tension thickened. Jackson remained outwardly calm. "The real threat is internal, you mean?" "The old guard." "The old guard is loyal to Silas' structure," Marcus corrected, his voice resonating slightly in the concrete chamber. "Silas designed the network so that if any regional supervisor went down, the others would immediately move to annex his territory. It's self-correcting chaos. The real threat is the vacuum that the central leadership might create." Jackson realized what Marcus was hinting at. If Vivian were to retire or disappear, or if the new signatory proves incapable of securing the assets, Marcus finished. "My loyalty is to the security of the estate. Always has been. The paperwork makes you the legal face. Your actions make you the authority. If you fail to maintain authority, my protocols shift. And those protocols involve eliminating the liability," Jackson stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Marcus gave the slightest nod. "You are currently a protected asset, Jackson. Remain useful." The conversation, brief and brutally honest, was another level unlocked. Marcus wasn't a blind thug. He was the calculating executor of a brutal system of order. Jackson now understood that his security budget wasn't just for cameras. It was the cost of keeping Marcus' loyalty focused on protecting him rather than executing him. Weeks later, the necessity of Jackson's physical involvement could no longer be avoided. The New England operation, historically run with iron-fisted efficiency by a man named Dominic, was failing to deliver expected returns. Dominic was Silas' contemporary, a man who had known Blackwood Manor when Silas was still alive, and who viewed Vivian with cold suspicion and Jackson with open contempt. Vivian received an encrypted message indicating that the New England transport network, crucial for moving high-value stolen goods and currency across the border, was under threat from a rival group. Dominic was demanding immediate capital and tactical support, viewing Jackson's recent ascension as the cause of the instability. "Dominic sees this as a test of the new administration's competence," Vivian explained, pacing the study. "If we fail to secure the operation, he will seize his territory, blame us for the loss, and challenge the entire structure, inviting the others to follow suit. We cannot afford chaos in the north." "What is the play?" Jackson asked, immediately moving to the tactical map, displaying the network of shell companies and known operational zones. His panic was gone, replaced by the detached focus of a commander. "We are sending Marcus and a heavy contingent to Boston to stabilize the ground. But Dominic won't listen to Marcus on financial matters. He needs to see that the center, the control point, is active and knowledgeable. He needs to see you." Jackson froze. "I am not to leave the manor." That was the core understanding. "Circumstances have changed, Jackson. You are the legal principal. Silas never ran his empire from behind a desk." He showed his face, he exerted presence. "Dominic wants to look you in the eye and assess if you have the mettle to control him. If you refuse this meeting, he will interpret it as cowardice, and we lose Boston." The gravity of the request was immense. Leaving Blackwood Manor meant leaving the physical fortress, the one place where Marcus' full, unwavering security protocols were guaranteed. Out there, Jackson was vulnerable, a target worth millions. Vivian arranged a meeting at a highly secure, neutral location, an old, decommissioned mill warehouse in rural Massachusetts, far from the established territories, chosen specifically for its defensible position. The day of the meeting, a frigid day in late November, felt less like a business trip and more like a trip to the gallows. Jackson dressed impeccably, a bespoke suit tailored to project the necessary authority. He ran over the financial particulars of the Boston operation one last time. He needed to know Dominic's books better than Dominic did. As he descended the grand staircase, Marcus waited, flanked by 4 heavily armed silent men. Marcus was wearing a heavy, tailored coat that did little to conceal the bulk of his frame or the presence of multiple weapons. The vehicle is armored. The route is secured. 2 minutes out, you follow my exact instructions, Marcus said, his gaze locked on Jackson's eyes. Do not move without my signal. Do not make unnecessary conversation. And do not, under any circumstances, show uncertainty. Understood, Marcus, Jackson affirmed. He took a deep breath. This was the true test of authority. Not the telephone confrontation with Phoenix, but the physical entry into the operational field. The journey was a blur of high-speed, calculated driving and tense silence. Jackson looked out the armored window, seeing the world rushing by, a world he could no longer truly inhabit. He was traveling from one bubble of control, Blackwood Manor, to another, the temporary stronghold. The warehouse was imposing, a cold concrete monolith on the edge of a frozen river. As the car pulled inside a loading dock bay, heavy steel doors immediately slammed shut behind them. The air was thick with tension and the smell of industrial decay. Dominic was waiting inside, surrounded by 6 men, all built like concrete and radiating menace. Dominic was older than Jackson expected, perhaps in his early 60s, heavy-set, wearing a thick leather jacket, his eyes small and watchful. Jackson and Marcus stepped out of the armored vehicle. Marcus immediately positioned himself 2 steps behind Jackson, his hands subtly placed near the lapels of his coat. Jackson Reed, Dominic's voice, was a low growl, echoing slightly in the vast space. He didn't offer a hand. The college air. We hear you've been counting our pennies from the comforts of Blackwood. Dominic, Jackson acknowledged, keeping his voice even and controlled. The estate's assets are under my management. I am here to resolve the instability in your region. The recent dip in revenue suggests a tactical failure, not a financial one. Dominic laughed, a short, ugly sound. Tactical failure? We're being squeezed, boy. The Irish are making a move on the ports. I need men and resources. I sent the request for immediate capital 3 days ago. Your widow denied it. Vivian denied the unjustified request, Jackson corrected sharply, pulling the file from his inner pocket. Your report listed the full expenditure for the previous quarter at $1.8 million, citing security enhancements. Yet the surveillance data from the New Bedford docks shows no significant change in patrol schedules, only an unexplained transfer of $400,000 to an offshore account registered in Panama. Jackson didn't just recite the numbers. He used the specifics from Dominic's own internal reports, information only available to the highest levels of the central administration. Dominic's eyes narrowed instantly, the laughter gone. His men shifted uneasily. They were used to intimidation, not meticulous financial accountability. That's internal business, Dominic spat. You don't cross-reference my security budget, kid. That money was contingency. Contingency for what, Dominic? Jackson pressed, stepping closer, ignoring the instinct screaming at him to retreat. He remembered Vivian's training. Authority is granted to those who do not fear the consequence of challenging. The account is registered under the name Silver Anchor Holdings. I cross-referenced the registration details with the Crimson Ledger, Jackson continued, the name of Silas' personal record a powerful invocation of the old authority. Silas reserved Silver Anchor for personal payouts, usually as severance for high-risk, non-sanctioned operations. That money was not contingency for security, it was a preemptive escape fund. You were preparing to abandon the New England network and take the operating capital with you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dominic's face flushed dark red, his eyes burning with fury and humiliation. Jackson had exposed him not as a failing supervisor, but as a traitor trying to steal from the estate. Dominic made a sudden, aggressive move, lunging forward, stopping just inches from Jackson's face. His breath smelled of stale whiskey and smoke. You think a suit and some paperwork makes you Silas Thorne? Dominic hissed, his voice trembling with rage. I knew Silas when you were still playing with toys. I run the muscle. You run the numbers. You have no right to question my loyalty or my actions. This was the moment, the high-intensity climax. Dominic was challenging not just Jackson's judgment, but his right to exist in this hierarchy. He needed to prove that the blood running through the syndicate's financial veins was now controlled by Jackson. Jackson did not back away. He held Dominic's gaze, his own eyes cold, reflecting the long, relentless months of training. Silas ran the organization on two principles: absolute obedience and the immediate, brutal disposal of any liability, Jackson said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. You claim loyalty to Silas, but you violated the covenant. Jackson lifted his hand slightly, a small, subtle signal he and Vivian had rehearsed, the closure signal. The Newark disbursement to Phoenix was approved because Phoenix kept the channel open. You attempted to sever the channel and steal the capital. That is treason to the structure, Dominic, not just to the estate, and I know what happens to traitors. Jackson shifted his weight, and as he did, he glanced quickly to his right. Marcus. Marcus had not moved. He was a statue of pure readiness, but Jackson saw it, the subtle relaxation in Marcus's shoulders. Marcus had been waiting for Jackson to falter, to show fear, or to call for help. Jackson had done none of those things. He had fought the battle with the ledger, not the gun, and he had won the immediate tactical advantage. Dominic, sensing the shift in Marcus' posture, hesitated. He looked past Jackson, searching for support from his own men, but they were now looking at Marcus, whose reputation preceded him like a physical force field. Jackson pushed his advantage, pressing the ultimate terror of the system into Dominic's face. Your security enhancements were fraudulent, the one. 8 million you claim was spent will be audited, line item by line item. By my team by dawn tomorrow, Jackson dictated, adopting the precise tone Vivian had perfected. Effective immediately, the New England operational finances will be managed directly through Blackwood Manor for the next 90 days. Your operational expenditures will be approved on a day-by-day basis. If your losses continue, Dominic, I will assume you are a systemic liability. Dominic stared at him, breathing heavily, trapped. He couldn't kill Jackson without inciting a war with Vivian, and crucially, making himself a target for Marcus and the rest of the regional supervisors who valued structure over personal gain. You think you can run Boston from your silk mansion? Dominic finally choked out. I run the entire structure, Dominic, and you will comply or you will be replaced. The choice is yours, Jackson concluded, his voice ringing with finality. Jackson turned his back on Dominic, the ultimate sign of contempt and confidence, and walked toward the armored vehicle. Marcus followed, his movements fluid and watchful, covering the retreat. As Jackson settled back into the heavily reinforced seat, the doors hissed open, and the car pulled out into the cold Massachusetts daylight. The moment they were away, Jackson sagged against the leather, the adrenaline draining out, leaving him shaky and nauseated. He had faced down a killer, using only his memory of accounting codes and the cold authority he had learned. Marcus, sitting in the front passenger seat, spoke into the intercom, connecting them. You didn't flinch, Marcus said, his voice a low, rare commendation. You used the ledger. He didn't know you knew about Silver Anchor. Vivian prepared me, Jackson managed, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. Vivian can teach the documents, Marcus replied, but she cannot teach the presence. You handled it. Jackson realized the full meaning of the interaction. Marcus hadn't been waiting for Jackson to win. He had been waiting for Jackson to display the inherent cruelty and control necessary to survive the Thorne legacy. By exposing Dominic and imposing extreme financial control, Jackson had proven he was capable of maintaining Silas' ruthless order. Marcus' protection was now solidified, earned through a display of intellectual and emotional brutality. When they returned to Blackwood Manor hours later, the lights seemed to burn brighter. The cold formality of the mansion felt less like a prison and more like a citadel of earned authority. Vivian met him in the study, a single glass of amber liquid in her hand. She didn't ask how it went. She simply observed his face, the lingering exhaustion masked by the hardened core of success. Dominic will be compliant for the foreseeable future, Jackson reported, hanging his coat on the stand himself. He knows I have access to the deep accounts and the ledger's specifics. I placed the entire New England operation under direct fiscal oversight for 90 days. Vivian nodded slowly, taking a sip of her drink. Perfect. You forced him into a position where challenging you is existential risk. You are no longer just the proxy, Jackson. You are the regulator. The men who run Silas' operation now report to you not out of legal necessity, but out of fear of audit and exposure. Jackson sat down opposite her, the adrenaline replaced by a chilling clarity. This was never about money, was it, Vivian? Jackson asked. the answer already clear in his mind. You needed a shield that could fight back. Silas' death created a power vacuum. You used me, the outsider, to restore equilibrium, knowing that my desperation for money would make me a quick study in survival. Vivian looked at him, her grey eyes reflecting the glow of the room's fireplace. She didn't deny it. Silas died 5 years ago, Jackson. He was shot in his own private box at the racetrack. A clean, professional hit, never solved. They tested me for months afterward. They thought the empire would crumble. I held it together with bureaucracy and silence, Vivian explained, her voice tinged with the only real vulnerability Jackson had ever heard from her. But a widow, even one who knows the ledger by heart, can only hold the line for so long. They respect tradition, they respect strength, and they respect ruthlessness. You provided all three. She set her glass down, the crystal ringing softly. You are the central sentinel, Jackson. You wear the face of legitimacy while possessing the secrets of the darkness. You are the perfect barrier. The implication hung heavily in the air. Jackson was not an heir waiting for Vivian's death. He was the primary defender of the fortune now. Jackson understood his fate completely. He had sought salvation from debt, and instead found a life sentence in a world governed by violence, administered by paperwork, and enforced by Marcus. There was no going back to Cresthaven University, no shedding the mantle of the Thorn legacy. He was too deeply embedded, too privy to the secrets contained within the Crimson Ledger, too lethal in his newfound knowledge. Later that night, Jackson stood in his suite, looking at the distant lights of the city that seemed impossibly far away. He reached into his pocket and touched the ivory keycard he still kept hidden. He didn't need it to access the vault. He had the combination memorized, but the card was a constant reminder of the discovery that had derailed his life. He was bound by the pre-nuptial covenant, secured by the brutal loyalty of Marcus, and controlled by the enigmatic intelligence of Vivian. He was the most dangerous man in the syndicate, not because he carried a gun, but because he carried the books. Jackson walked over to the desk, sat down, and pulled out a stack of documents concerning the New England financial audit. He picked up his pen, the silence of Blackwood Manor enveloping him. He had learned to fear the men who ruled the streets, but he had learned to command them using the language of their own dark accounting. The poor student was gone. Jackson Reed was now the undisputed, cold-blooded guardian of a fortune built on blood. He had chosen survival, and survival demanded perpetual, ruthless vigilance. He leaned forward, focused on the first ledger entry, ready to manage his violent inheritance. Blackwood Manor was his control room, his fortress, and his grave, all in one. His future was sealed, not in hope, but in the cold steel of necessary control. Hit the thumbs up and join the crew.